I am Jeff Foxworthy, and welcome to Gamekeeper Podcast. If you want to learn more about farming for wildlife and habitat management, then, buddy, you are in the right place. Join the Gamekeeper crew direct from Mossy Oak Land Enhancement Studio as they discuss the latest wildlife and habitat management practices, news, and, of course, hunting. There's no telling what you'll learn, but I'm going to tell you, I bet it's interesting. Enjoy.
We're live in 3, 2, 1.
Here we are, everybody. West Point, Mississippi.
Oh, is that the
Snarky
Snarky Puppies?
Oh, my favorite band. That is exactly what they sound like.
Oh, huh.
Toxie, you missed all that last week.
I
And
guess
you
I
wouldn't
did.
you wouldn't believe the responses I got of people taking up for me.
Well, I think it's a great band. It's just not, Bobby's used to John Denver and Neil Diamond. It's kind of out of his genre.
Barry Manilow.
Yeah,
It's
Barry
it's
Manilow.
out
Barry
of my
Banana
genre.
Nose.
Out of
Yep.
your genre.
Karen Carpenter.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
Those that's my genre. for
Michael
sure.
McDonald.
That was before your time, actually.
But I love Karen Carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
What about Christopher Cross?
I like them all. I
Yeah,
do
he's
that
good, he's
too.
good.
Chris Cross.
Huh? I've never heard of him.
So I just never
Al Jarreau.
have you ever
Yacht
heard
Rock.
of Snarky Puppy, Toxie?
A what?
Yeah.
Here's your answer right
we don't
there.
have
A
to go into-
snarky puppy? We don't have snarky puppies at Mossy Oak.
No, we got good
Gamekeeper
puppies.
Kennels. They're all
We have-
lovey-doveys.
We have biddable puppies.
That's right. We have lovey-dovey puppies. By the way, I went by there today, and they have 2 fresh in from offshore, from
Nice, straight from the UK.
straight from the UK. Beautiful puppies.
Yeah, boy.
Both girls, big breeders. They're just gorgeous.
Good deal. Good
Yep.
deal.
And they just arrived.
They just arrived yesterday.
What are their names?
I didn't catch the names. I know they're lovey-doveys, though. Boy,
I know.
they are sweeties.
Bill is a pro at naming those.
He
dogs.
really is.
And then
He
he
can-
remembers all of them.
Yep.
Yeah.
He does.
Sometimes they come with names because Forrest's dad that we bred to Willa came over, and he was named Cole already. So they just kept the name. And he is jet black, the darkest black.
He's cold black.
Midnight, yes.
Not
Everything about him.
COAL.
Yep. So I
That's a
figured
good name.
they named him Cole, COAL, but
A good
So
female.
what's Forrest's full name?
the Dark Forest of Mossy Oak.
Is it?
Mhm.
Nice.
That's a cool
That's
name.
a good one.
Yeah.
That's good.
I did it for multiple reasons
Yeah, I like it.
because he had a green collar. We were naming them by the because they were all identical.
Right.
I mean,
Well, you
girls and
raised
boys.
these in your house.
Yeah, in our laundry room.
So you had a different collar on them so you knew which one was
Oh,
which.
you talk about hard labor work. That was turkey season last year. I was getting up a good hour earlier if I wanted to go. It cut into the season well, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was so much trouble.
Wow.
But we had to put colored collars on them to keep up with which one was which in case. So this one had a green collar, and she would give them more creative names than red, green, blue. It was like apple or pumpkin or forest for forest green. I actually thought of that name. So everybody wants to know, how in the world did you pick out of 9 puppies? How did y'all pick Forest? I said, we didn't. He picked us.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's kind of how it went down. So Forest, I like the green color of Forest, but I've always like my running mate now, my business partner of the last 10 years is Gus. And
Yeah.
I named him from,
Augustus.
Augustus
Lonesome
McCrae, Lonesome Dove. Yep.
That's right.
One of my favorite characters in the movie. And probably my tied for favorite character with Gus from Lonesome Dove is Forrest Gump.
No doubt.
So this is Forrest.
That's a good one.
And I'm kind of a tree nerd like Dudley. So
Yes, you
Forrest
are.
just kind of hit the bill all the way
Yes, you
around.
are.
Yeah.
Oh.
Good
Wow.
name.
He's a special pup, I can tell you that.
Well,
Today we're going to be talking about fish.
Yes,
and I
sir.
know that's going to excite Dudley, but it's not the kind of
it's not
fish
that-
that
It's not the band.
It's
not
not,
the
the band.
That's a
But-
shame.
we are talking about fish.
We are.
Is that? I don't think that's fish.
Oh, my
That must be
gosh.
some more snarky puppies.
Oh boy.
So we've got as a guest today, and we'll get to him, but we'll go ahead and introduce him so he can jump in. He's been sitting here looking at us like,
Patiently.
boy,
Yeah,
what have
what are
I
you
driven
talking
all the way over
Yeah,
here
who
to do?
are these people?
So we've got from Montgomery, Alabama, Robby Mays, who's a fisheries biologist, expert
He
at
is.
all things
He
to
is.
do with pond management. And here you are sitting in the studio on the couch.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me here.
Long drive, but this is the way to do it. When we can have a guest sit on the couch, it's so much better.
Yeah.
It really is.
It is.
It takes all the pressure off of Richie to get that audio sound.
I'll have to brag on him because an unnamed, very respected sources in his industry described him to me as probably the most knowledgeable and / concerned for his clients of any person I've ever met.
Wow.
High
Pretty,
praise.
pretty good high praise right there.
Yeah, it is.
Yep.
Right there.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Is that true?
Well, he pulled
tried.
it. If it isn't true, he pulled it off. So
he did well.
let's just give it to him.
I try hard. I appreciate that very much.
Well, he's done work for us before, so I can vouch for it. So.
Yeah. Well, so we've talked ponds before,
Yeah.
and we're going to go kind of down a little bit different road with you here, but it's a subject. There's a lot of opinions about stuff, but there's a lot of facts too.
Well, let me just proceed all this conversation too with at least this, if I can keep my mouth shut the rest of the time and just listen and learn from him. But for 25 years plus now, when I was asked the question, because I guess about 30 years ago when I was first able to scrape some money together and buy my first place, which we all know where it is, and it's expanded and a dream come true now. But what I learned was, and people started asking me about buying a place, now it's become almost everybody's dream to have some place of their own. I said the first thing I would do is be sure you get somewhere. If you want an enjoyment from a recreational property, buy somewhere you can build a pond or that has a pond. And what I learned was that's the single top enjoyment thing you can have, because, I mean, if we have some turkeys or ducks or deer, I mean, you can't replenish them, or you can't just take a whole bunch of people. I mean, I guess a dove hunt, if you're lucky enough to have some doves, you could, but year-round enjoyment, have your kids, more kids, whatever, a group from the church come out and go fishing or whatever. The first thing I would always do is build a fish pond. And there is, with these guys, there is a formula to go by if you'll just listen to them and adhere to it. This is guaranteed as anything in owning land. Second thing I would, along with that, I would have some kind of little structure, could be some kind of little just small camp or whatever, so you can go stay on your place. But that's the two most important things, way above deer, turkey, duck, or whatever. Number one, a fish pond. And ask Cuz now, if he's on land for a while, he would back me up to 100%. His top priority for his grandkids is a fishing pond.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of
100%.
sense.
Learn that way. You can share it. It's hard to share sometimes when it's going to deplete your resource to a point where you're hurting them, But with fishing, you really need, our biggest problem is we don't fish them enough.
Yeah, that's true.
So we need more and more people fishing them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So a lot of people's problems. So, but look, before we get started with Robby, so just get comfortable. You got you some water there, but let's talk about blood on the biological.
Yeah.
What's everybody hearing and seeing?
Well, the season's winding down for sure. I know Neil got on the board late, didn't he?
Yeah, and
With a
I
super
think his dad actually the next day probably did.
What? I hear you. So, got a little blood on the biological.
Yeah,
He's very, very sarcastic in the way.
Neil's hunt reminded me of yours, where he had to,
The barefoot, yeah.
Yeah, he went barefoot. I think
He
he had his
swam.
pants on, unlike you.
He swam the
But-
creek. He said he swam, but it was up to his armpits. He took his breeches off and took his boots off and waded all the way. It's a very large creek, and crossed it and just up right on the other bank. And to everybody out there, property's on the other side too, but not a long stretch of it. I think it was in a cutover right on the property line, and caught him off of it. Anyway, he was just on the creek bank, still barefooted, no boots.
Unlike you, he was gentlemanly enough to put his clothing back on before he
That's right, Bob.
called in a turkey.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say that is not the first turkey Neil has killed barefooted.
No, in fact, it's not even the second
No,
one.
he's killed a lot of them barefooted.
Several.
I even had somebody message me and say, why do the Hayes boys always have their shoes off?
Yeah, it's
that's,
like
that's called genetics.
yeah, like his father.
Yep.
Hey, it's not the time to get in it, but there's also something called grounding.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you should probably try that.
Called what?
Grounding. It's basically your body being
That's right. Touching the earth.
Mhm.
That's correct.
I have heard recently about that. A guy was saying
We're
it made him a
famous.
lot healthier.
Yes.
I'm famous for
Yeah.
barefooted. In
He's-
fact, whenever I see somebody walking around barefooted at any time, I've got a pair of shoes just like those. They're my favorites.
You should try that. Get your dogs out, let them walk around on the ground there,
Yeah, I need to
Bobby.
do that some.
Yeah.
Look, yesterday I planted some sunflowers with this old-fashioned push
One-row planter?
row
Yeah.
planter, one row at a time.
Oh, I've got one.
It
yeah.
just about killed me.
It's not easy. Well, how many sunflowers did you plant with it?
3. Now, I don't know how. I mean, it was a 6 rows, and they were about 100 yards long.
Wow.
But that thing, that was a lot
So
of work.
600 yards with a push planter was rough on you.
Well, especially I bet it was freshly disced up.
It was.
And it just kept on hanging up in the dirt.
Yeah,
you have
I
to
don't
come.
know.
You need to run a little cultipacker or something over it. I've done that before, but just a garden spot, not for a dove field.
Well,
I know
that's
you're
the first.
excited about that little chafing cedar, though.
Yeah, well, it worked great.
Yeah.
It
I could
does.
tell it was
just
dropping seed.
hangs
like
up on
yeah.
the little grass rhizomes and stuff like that before
Yep.
they.
Yeah, that was
Right
the
now.
best. That's right. So, well,
So what were you planting? Sunflowers?
sunflowers. So,
No.
so dove season. Well, I guess that's next on the schedule.
So we got a little ponderosa.
No, squirrel season.
Oh yeah, we're talking about that.
That's
It
right.
starts in what? May.
So why do they let us shoot squirrel? Robbie, we'll get to you, I promise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
but why do
Robbie's
they let
like,
us-
why'd I even come up here?
So-
I don't know. They've been doing it across the Midwest and places I've read about, Missouri, Tennessee, places. They just started here, and I think in Alabama too.
I think it's a good way to get
Look it up. Yeah,
get younger folks outside.
I think it is too.
you know.
Evidently, biologically, there's a little window where it's good, and safe and whatever. So
Well, I'm gonna tell you what, they're gonna be harder to see right now.
I've been talking about it forever that I want to go because I love squirrel hunting. I've done maybe one time gone in the spring, but I plan on it. We'll see.
Robbie,
Talk about fish.
we'll
Yeah.
get you back up here, Robbie, and we'll take you on a squirrel hunt in
World
the
class
latter
squirrel
part of May. Bring some Promethean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
don't go barefoot.
Permethrin.
Yeah.
Promethean.
Promethean is a movie.
Oh, that is right. Forgot about that.
Yeah. Well, Robbie, it's rough around here.
They're on you, aren't they?
Yeah.
Hey, wait a minute now. He's the king.
Wait a minute.
So, Robbie, look, we want to talk to you about ponds. And you came up, you got here a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Lanny that took you to a pond on a lease that we've got. So pretty big.
Yeah, it's got a irrigation reservoir on it where they're doing some center pivot row crop stuff. So it's a sizable pond.
It's got a moss problem, algae
You
problem.
gotta-
And
yeah,
so,
I brought you a bucket of it.
so that's one of the things we want to talk about. But right out of the gate, your business is called Pond and Lake Services. What's the difference in a pond and a lake?
Different people have different definitions of it, but mostly it's the size. So generally, I've always kind of gone with 5 acres and under is a pond, and bigger than 5 acres is a lake. I've heard some people saying 10 acres is the cutoff, but if you own it, it's 1 acre, and you want to call it a lake, it's your lake.
There you go.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
What I say
Okay.
about client being happy.
Yeah,
Well, do you say dams or levees?
dams.
Okay. So when I moved up here,
I'm-
levee is the word.
No, I mean the pond levee maybe, but levee's more like a duck pond levee, or a levee on the river,
Yeah, that protects the river.
Yeah.
Yeah, the same all the way where pond dams. I mean, I would go with pond dams. Well, we call them both.
Okay. So
Yeah,
we
and
got
I-
that out of the way.
And I come from a hatchery background, so there's a lot of levees on a hatchery, so we call them levees there. But when you're talking about like a hillside pond, we call it a dam.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what is the number, as a fisheries biologist, helping people manage their ponds? That's got to be very rewarding. But when you look at a pond, you can't see those assets that are in the water. How do you go about helping them understand just how good that pond is, or if that pond's got problems?
Yeah, looking at the water, a lot of times you can tell at least somewhat what's going on. So like when you walk up to the pond edge, if it's very clear, you can tell it's pretty unproductive for the most part. And you can ask a few questions like, if the customer has had the property for a while, how long has it been clear like that? Has it been several years, or has it just recently happened? Does it normally stay more of a green color? That'll tell you kind of roughly how productive it is. And if it's year after year after year of clear water, it's fairly unproductive, and it's most likely what we call bass crowded, which the bass have kind of overeaten the food chain, and the food chain isn't reproducing well enough because of that clear water to sustain a high enough standing crop of bait fish and to support those bass. And each year you still have the bass reproducing and building in number. So basically, like he was saying, the number one problem we run into is people don't harvest enough small bass from the population, and they just keep building and overeating the food chain.
So today's fishermen, if you go to a river or a large lake, reservoir, whatever, catch and release is kind of that's the way bass fishermen do it today,
Right.
for the most part. And so, but you can't do that. You can't adhere to that as strict as you can with these ponds. You've got to take some fish out of there.
That's right. And every pond is different. I always tell folks, you really need to pay attention to what's going on. If you don't have somebody come in and assess it for you, like electrofishing, then when you're catching fish, kind of keep up and pay attention to what you're catching. Because if you're sitting there catching bass that are roughly 10 to 14 inches, they all look the same size, they all look average in terms of plumpness or condition, that's a sign you need to remove some of them. And if you're paying attention to those things, you can kind of do it yourself. But if you go out there and you catch a variety of sizes of bass, they all look fairly healthy, that's a sign you're close to where you need to be. Each year you still need to remove some small bass, but there are situations where you go in and do an assessment and you don't have enough bass. It's kind of rare, but it happens. And so I don't like giving a blanket statement where you need to take out this many bass per acre per year, regardless of what's going on. If you do that, you could be messing up a good situation. So every pond is different. It's great to do an assessment on each one, but if you don't have the budget to do an assessment on it, then pay attention to what you're catching. If you could keep records on it, it'd be great. Length, weight records. You can figure the relative weight, which is an index we use to compare the condition of the bass you're catching to what they should be based on a standard. And so you can calculate that easily on your own or look up a chart online and you can tell, are my bass running where they should be weight-wise or are they thin? And that can help you decide what you need to do management-wise.
Lanny, how did when y'all went and looked at this moss problem? Let's start there because guys are wanting to fertilize their ponds, and you don't want to create a worse problem. But what did y'all find, and what was a suggestion?
Well, I think one of the first things that Robby saw was we had a lot of moss, and that's one of the first questions I asked is like, can we, start treating our weed problems, for lack of a better term? I guess those would be hydro weeds. I don't know what it would be.
Aquatic weeds.
Aquatic weeds. Treat that problem while we're also fertilizing, and the answer was overwhelmingly no, because it makes a lot of sense.
You be fertilizing?
Yeah, you want me to? Yeah, you want go ahead and explain the process.
Yeah, fertilizing. You're adding nutrients to the water. You have a lot of this aquatic vegetation in there. Those plants are gonna uptake the nutrients you're adding. It's like throwing gas on a fire. It's just gonna go crazy when it's that much that's already out there.
So there were multiple different aquatic the plant problems, I guess. What all did y'all identify?
Yeah, so we categorize aquatic plants as emergent, floating, or submersed. And so the first thing you saw when you come up, you have that filamentous algae, which is floating on the surface. And filamentous algae is, just like it sounds, filaments of plant that kind of get tangled together, kind of in a weave and kind of a mess looking. They tend to start on the bottom. They grow on the bottom, and then they produce oxygen during the day with sunlight and photosynthesis. The oxygen bubbles get trapped in the filaments, and it'll float it to the surface. And so then you see the mats floating around. And like we mentioned, if it rains hard, you have a thunderstorm, the rain can knock the air out of the mats, and they sink back down. So you can have a bad problem. You come out there the next day after a storm, it looks like it's gone. You're like, oh, I'm good to go. I can fertilize. Well, no, it's back down the bottom. It's going to float again. So you have the filamentous algae that's floating on the surface. And then below that, you had the submersed grass, which the type that you have is coontail, which is pretty common. It's rooted on the bottom and reaches up to the surface where it can. And it was probably coming up from depths of 6 feet or more to the surface in places. And, the upper end of the lake, the shallow end, was what we call topped out. There was vegetation from the bottom to the top with filamentous algae on top of it. And so you also had some emergent vegetation around the edges, cattails and some maiden cane, which, like we talked about, the having stuff along the shoreline is kind of personal preference. So if it's a very natural area, you don't have a home there, you might want to leave it a natural look to some degree. But if you had a lodge right there and you had kids outside playing and stuff, you might want it a little cleaner so it's less snaky, So yeah, there were multiple plants, But among the most problematic would be the coontail and the filamentous algae. That's what would need the most attention.
So does it take 2 different recipes to get those?
Yeah, so definitely need to apply herbicide in order to knock it back to a more manageable situation. But grass carp will do a good job on coontail. So you could put them in there. That would be a biological control that would be working. I would suggest also spraying with herbicide at the same time in order to come at it from 2 directions. Copper-based herbicides are good for algae. It will have an effect on coontail though, so that's one option. There's some other herbicides like diquat and things like that would work on the coontail better.
That's interesting stuff there.
Really interesting.
I've always had trouble, being a tree and plant nerd. I tend to not be as good at the aquatics. And so I'll get questions and I usually end up getting an answer from somebody like you and then contacting the customer back.
Yeah.
But it can get pretty confusing.
That's right.
Like when we fertilize a pond, in my layman's terms way of saying it, it greens up, and that could block the sunlight for some of these things that you don't want. But on the other hand, it could increase them. And it seems like you just have to know your aquatic plants to a T to know how to prescribe, what to do to get rid of it.
That's right. Yeah, and it's the timing of it. So if we would have gotten there and it was just a small band right around the edges, what I would suggest if I was managing that is I would be ready to go ahead and fertilize the middle of the lake, try to stay in deeper water, and Perfect Pond Plus works great. You can apply it broadcast scoop, or I like to, if I'm in a boat, I put it in the prop wash of the boat just as I'm motoring along, and put it in the deeper water, put it in the middle of the lake, keep it away from the shallows, away from those plants, and then go ahead and spray the band of algae around the edges. But as bad as it was, it's covering significant acreage, so it's too late to get ahead of it with the plankton bloom and shading it out. It's already topped out in places, so it's right there at the sunlight. So it's a balancing act, trying to keep the lake fertile enough, keep the vegetation at bay enough to where it's fishable, and the vegetation is not just taking up the nutrients and getting worse and worse on you, because you'll be throwing money both ends of it, the fertilizer and the herbicide. So it is a balancing act, but you have to make the call that you have to make the call whether or not it's time to fertilize, or let's hold off for 2 weeks, let's spray this stuff, let it die, then I'll come in with the fertilizer.
So on a lake this large, and I think we're talking, this was about 30 acres.
Yeah, roughly 30.
So would you, if you were going to spray herbicide, you wouldn't spray the whole thing the same day, would you? Or would
No,
would you compartmentalize it, so to speak?
That's right, yeah. So on the labels of these herbicides, they say break it up into sections, and they give you a timeline. So most of the time it's break it up into thirds. You treat 1/3, wait 2 to 4 weeks, depending on what herbicide you're using, and then treat the next third, same thing, wait 2 to 4 weeks, treat the next third. And the point of that is you can only have so much vegetation dying at one time, because as it dies and decomposes, it takes oxygen out of the water. So if you were to treat that entire water body, you would likely have a fish kill because of the oxygen depletion as that stuff breaks down. And so it's a long-term process of getting something like that turned around. It'll take months if you stay on it.
So at lunch, I heard you referring to if somebody has windrowed a bunch of timber, they've created a place for their pond and they've cut the timber and windrowed it. And as that pond fills up with water, that because there's so much stuff decaying in there that it can take a while. I don't remember the exact time period before you can actually stock that pond because the oxygen is being depleted by the decay. Can you explain that just a little bit?
Yes, sir. Yeah. So we see that on newer lakes occasionally. So if the lake basin had a lot of timber in it and the timber was knocked over and windrowed, or sometimes if you leave the timber standing and it's a lot of it. So once that water comes up on the timber and starts flooding it, in order to start breaking the wood down or the bark and all that process of decomposition does take oxygen out of the water. And so we've seen where we're trying to stock brand new fish into a lake that just filled up. It could be months before it's suitable oxygen wise to support the fish. There was a lake in North Mississippi I dealt with It ended up being about 8 acres. They flooded a bunch of small pines, and it took probably 8 months to get to a point where we could stock it. And we tried probably 3 times stocking the fish. We brought the truck up and everything, checked the oxygen. The oxygen reading was like 3 parts per million in the middle of the day, which is low. And so that means at night it's going to be unsuitable for fish. So we had to just plan to come back and try again later. But it ended up being about an 8-month process to be able to stock it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, so Mr. Fox has a pond that is one of the best I've ever fished in. And I never got to see it before it filled with water. But just as I learned to fish it, I always felt like somebody had windrowed the center of that pond.
They just had piles. They broke out all the residual dirt mound and logs and debris into individual piles. And I guess there's probably 6 or 8 of those throughout there. And a lot of them are in the deepest basin up through there.
Yeah.
But there's not a straight windrow.
Okay. Well,
Not a large one. You know, maybe those are real small windrows, but it's not like one main windrow. No.
sure. But I tell you what, that structure held fish.
Oh yeah,
More.
and it got fished a lot more than we have, and it has lasted longer. Although it's probably to the point of doing some stuff. One year it became really, really just out of the blue, and there's not really red dirt. It's like a red, muddy color. And I think the word is turbid. Isn't that right for that? Yeah. And I think Dr. Brunson helped him at State actually way back then. Something was done. He held off on something, and then I forgot what they did, and it cleared it up. But it wasn't a productive, like that algae look that's real, fertile. It was really muddy, just like a muddy mud puddle all of a sudden out of nowhere.
Do you see that often?
I think there's up the drainage part was where they did some farming. The neighbors had, and I surely that's probably the only thing that could really cause it somewhere like that is that a sudden rain on some dished up farmland, ran into it probably.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is some newly shaved off dirt or something like that. Somebody started construction on something in the watershed.
It was a farm operation. I'm sure of it. But if I remember right, you can correct me now, but he said it kind of just goes into almost a lockdown mode. Stuff doesn't move as much, they don't bite as much. And if it stays that way long term, it can really set your pond back. But if it clears up, you'll be fine. But, you don't need a fertilizer right now. You're probably not going to catch a lot of fish. And so I think it was kind of like that. It's kind of almost like the wintertime all of a sudden. And then it cleared up and went back to normal and never had a problem again.
Well, while we're talking about structure, can you hit on what is too much structure? Can you have too little structure?
Yeah.
What depths does it need to be at?
And if you already have because most people already have their lake, 95% aren't contemplating building one right now. So what can you do, now? Yeah, if you already have your lake and you missed out on doing it when you built the lake, that's a really good, and I'm listening myself to that one.
Yeah, so I have seen some places where I thought there was too much structure, and a lot of times it was places that they flooded standing timber, and so it was just trees all throughout the middle of this thing. And like when we're electrofishing, just like you would be, fishing, angling, and you'd be going from tree to tree to tree trying to find these fish. It just spreads them out, basically. And so you can kind of think of it as reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. You want to concentrate the fish in certain areas. And so if you know your lake and you have some points, drop-offs, a creek channel, stuff like that, those would be ideal places to place the stuff. So what I do, especially with artificial structure or cedar trees, things like that you might have on your property, you can cut those down, drag them to the pond bank, tie cinder blocks to them, and sink them. But what I try to do is make a site rather than just one tree here, one tree over there, one tree over there. Make a site with 5 or 6 pieces, make a large area, maybe the size of this room, that you can cast over a little bit. And so draw the fish to this general area. In places like larger lakes where we put a lot of artificial structure, we ended up putting like 1 1 or 2 good sites per acre
Wow.
to try to draw the fish to known areas where people could go to. They knew where the structure was, so they could try to have better success. If it's an existing lake, like you're talking about, what I would do is, if you know of drop-offs, points and things, I would drop structure there to start with. And then I would just have it in my mind, like every year I'm going to add to that spot, put 2 or 3 pieces there, because whatever you put, especially if it's hardwood trees or if it's soft trees, they break down fast, but hardwood trees, they will break down after a few years.
So is a green cedar is fine?
Green cedar, yeah, it's fine.
How long do you think it will last with its cover?
Yeah, so 3 to 4 years.
Okay, that's pretty good.
After that, you see just the trunk and
Right.
and all the twigs are kind of
Okay.
decomposed off of it. But it's an ongoing process if you want to keep the structure out there, because I'm sure you've seen places used to have standing timber. The timber's fallen in now and all that. So it's an ongoing process to try to have it out there. So standing timber is too much, in my opinion. If you're going to be adding artificial stuff, I would make sites out of it. If you had a 2-acre pond, I would put 5 or 6 sites in strategic places.
Gotcha. So some in the shallows, maybe some on the edge of a drop off. Just try to mix it up.
That's right. And I tend not to go to the deepest water. Like if you have water 15, 20 feet deep, most of the time the fish are not going to be down that deep, depending on what you have. So I would go more toward, moderate depths, 10 feet and less. Right. It's good to put stuff like cedar trees along the shoreline for bluegill, because you want to have the bluegill need cover with small spaces. So like cedar trees, there's some artificial stuff that has tight spaces where the bluegill can get in there and get away from the bass. If you put big stuff in there like a treetop and stuff like that, you'll have bluegill around there, but not necessarily smaller ones. You'll have big bass, you'll have bluegill that are hand size and stuff hanging around those, but those youngest bluegill need some cover to try to get away from.
So the
predators.
cover is not just for fishing spots. More importantly, it is so your forage fish can survive better and longer and perpetuate themselves and not just be wiped out.
That's right. And this is kind of where the vegetation versus hard structure comes in. How much vegetation is too much in a fertilized pond? So if you have shoreline cover for these young fish, it's good, it's natural, but it depends on what it is. So if it's lily pads or water willow or something like that, that's not going to just take over on you, those are good plants to have. But if it's coontail, you see what coontail can do on its own.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And then if you fertilize as well, that could be that much more of a problem. So it depends on what plant you have. So sometimes in these fertilized systems, it's almost better not to have any vegetation and then just have the hard structure and you add to it, depending on what your lake is.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna get selfish free. It won't be free consulting real quick. So we had the pond near Gainesville, and a big one. It's over 40 acres, and we inherited it because of an old tram line went across there and informed the pond. When we fixed all the holes in whatever, actually the biggest reason, the nutria just destroyed the dam. And what I found from one of our great friends, is a great pond builder. He didn't build that one. The one Bobby loves so much,
yeah, David Bryan.
Yeah. And he had put bull panel all the way across the shoreline when he built one for me that was basically butts up to the Noxubee River. And I didn't even know it till he was done. He said, just trust me. So I didn't do that. And the nutria just destroyed. In fact, the nutria moved in, Swiss cheese the whole dam, and then the beavers took it over. And it was just a complete disaster. We had to rebuild the whole thing. Here's the big question, though. It was inundated with, I guess, the lily pads that are so invasive, or lotus. Is that right?
Lotus, the big ones, yeah.
Yes. And so I was curious if it's been completely dry for a whole year or so before we flooded it again. Will it have knocked it back completely or largely?
Yeah, for the most part, it should knock it back pretty good, but those things have big seed pods on them.
Right, they do.
And those seed
It looked like
pods,
an acre. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
The little seed looks just like an acre. You know, but they're very invasive. And I think what I didn't heed was before, it's like when they started, it's like, it's so cool. Just a few little lily pads and you throw your bait and you fish around them and stuff. And then they weren't really lily pads, though, that lotus, and they took it completely over because the deepest part of this lake was like 9 or 10 feet. That was it. Very shallow for the most part, very even as far as that. But I'm telling you, they completely destroyed that, and I was so scared to use too much of the right kind of chemical. I think they recommended like granular 2,4-D or something like that. And I just like, they say it's fine, but I didn't want to put that kind of chemical in my pond, and 40 acres is a lot to spend for an expensive herbicide. So I'm glad I redid it, and I've done it. It's behind me now, but I want to be sure we do it right going forward. And if that stuff shows up, we need to jump on it immediately is my question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. As soon as you see it, if you don't want it there, go ahead and knock it out, because you see how it can proliferate.
Oh, it was unbelievable. So
I tell you what, though, it sure is fun to throw a worm up on it and just ease it off.
Well, I tell you what's a great pitch or statement for artificial structure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd buy some artificial cheap lily pads of some form, because there are very few things in nature. That's not why I like the cedar trees, because they actually slowly degrade. They don't spread and take over your lake. And so these, man, there's so many aquatic weeds that can just shut your pond down. And the fix is not good sometimes, you know.
So our friends at Mossback Structures,
they have a great
they've
one.
got some good stuff.
They got some great ones.
Yeah, they've advertised with us for a number of years. So yeah, that'd be one to look at. So look, Dudley, have you got a?
Yeah, I got a bunch.
Okay.
One of my questions I had was what is an ideal depth when you're building a pond? I always, I've talked to a few extension agents and read these publications, and even took a brief class during summer camp and forestry school. And the professor was saying, a lot of people think they know how to build a pond, and they go and do it. And then it's not even close. And then it causes a lot of problems. So, if you were to build a new pond for fishing, what would be the ideal depth? Like, would you have a couple of deep areas? And can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And a lot of that is depends on your site and how tall you can build the dam based on the layout of the land. But one of the more important things is you want it to drop off to 3 feet pretty quickly, because if you have it shallower than that in areas, you're going to have vegetation problems at some point, and it could be a headache for you down the road. So as far as the deepest point, I mean, I've seen Great Lakes, great ponds that are 8 feet or less, but the shallower that it is, the hotter it'll be in the summertime and things like that. So it's kind of nice to have some deeper water. So if you could just pick, I would say, 15 feet, 20 feet maximum depth, and having depth changes is nice. So you have these different habitats where fish can hang wherever they want to, based on where the thermocline is or based on the time of year. So I would want depth changes. I would want some points, drop-offs, things like that, where you kind of sculpt it when it's under construction. It's kind of like, hey, let the dirt guy build the dam for you, and then you get on a excavator and dig out some holes and do some things to make it interesting, and then place your structure while it's under construction, if you can. So drop off the edges to 3 feet, have a nice slope all along the shoreline, so you don't have this long slope that just fills with algae.
So I was told, at least, I think by y'all, so you're looking at stocking rates, you really kind of look at how much 3 foot or more water you have.
Right.
And it's really, most the ponds I've seen, these pond builders that build ponds, I've seen them build, they know what they're doing, and it drops off. You very seldom, unless you want a little beach area, do you see it feather in. They know to do that. So a good, really easy, common sense thing in gamekeeping is like, it's the exact opposite of ducks. Anything over 3 foot is kind of a waste, unless you want a spot that stayed open in cold weather or something. So, the duck biologists say pretty much 2 feet and less. And the same thing with fish is like 3 feet or more.
Yeah, and something we run into a lot is cattle ponds, or ponds in cattle pastures. If they've had cattle access for years, the banks have been matted down and flattened out, basically just from their weight. And so a lot of times you'll see that in cattle ponds where we have a lot of vegetation along the shoreline 20 feet out, and then it's deep. So it depends on what you're working with and what you have to work with. So
how much does rock figure into structure for you? Do you put gravel down for beds, or do you put sand down in areas? Or
Yeah, pea gravel is very good for bluegill bedding primarily. And what I would suggest is folks that are doing that, lay down some landscaping cloth first, put the pea gravel on top of it. That way the pea gravel doesn't sink down into the soil over time. If you have a dock out there, have that wrap around your dock. And that way kids or grandkids out there fishing, you've got the attractant there for the brim already. So I've seen rock piles, like bigger riprap size rock. They hold larger fish. They'll hold larger bluegill and stuff. They'll get inside the crevices and whatnot. So that's good structure as well. The best structure overall, where I've found like electrofishing, the biggest bass would be like large hardwood treetops. So like if you had a tree and a storm fall into the lake, that treetop is going to hold some serious fish after a while. And so that tends to be the best structure. So anything you can do to mimic that shape and the branching and that type of thing seems to work really well.
Yeah. Lanny, I'm looking at you. I know your questions. Lanny's got some youngins that are really getting into fishing right now. So Lanny has spent a lot of his life chasing catfish up and down the Tombigbee River, and now his youngins want to go catch bass. So I'm having a lot of fun with Lanny because he used to make fun of me bass fishing, and I'd make fun of him for just chasing catfish all the time.
He had to just bring that up, didn't he?
Yeah. He just can't stand me.
He's so proud of it.
Yeah, he can't stand me eating an 8-pound largemouth. I don't know what his problem is.
Don't do
Careful now.
that. So, I know you've got a question.
Oh yeah, no, we spending time out there with Robby this morning. I'm sure you'll see some of the footage I was rapid firing out there. But what I learned is, just like with everything else, gamekeeping, it's a process, and it's something that has to be not constantly, but maintained on a regular basis. So, but once you do get ahead of it, it's a lot easier to manage. So we got a little work to do out there, but it's going to be, the work part of the fun to me. So
it is, no question.
To see it turn.
The work is more addictive than the consuming part.
So I did ask him this, and I'll ask him now for this particular site we're working on. Like I said, it's about a 30-acre, but it's an irrigation pond, so it's going to be used for center pivot irrigation. So I asked him about the use of herbicides and how that could affect possibly, the center pivot operation.
Yeah, the herbicides tend to have a water use restriction label on the label. It tells you what you can and can't do with the water after it's treated. So there are some herbicides, like the chelated coppers that are used for algae. They won't have any water use restriction. So you could swim, you could fish, you could use that water for irrigation. But there are others, like for what he'll probably need to use for the coontail, they'll have like a 2 to 5 day restriction on irrigation. So after you apply that herbicide, you can't use that water to irrigate crops.
I thought you were going to say 2 to 5 years. So 2 to 5 days is good.
Yeah, when he said 2 to 5 in the boat, I was like, oh, no, what's he going to say?
So the very popular, it is for me, because I buy a lot of it, a Mazamox is available as I believe, Clearcast.
Mazapir, yeah.
And I think it's expensive. A gallon an acre at $290 or $300 a gallon. But if I remember right, it said, go swimming or fishing that day, no problem, Yeah. So it's very safe. I think it's very expensive, but it's very safe.
Yeah, that one probably has an irrigation restriction on it, though.
Because it might affect the plants that you're irrigating.
It'll affect the plants. Yeah, that's right.
So I've got a question.
Read the label.
Read the label.
Ask a professional.
For sure, read the label.
My question, I hope you can figure out a way to answer this, but we ask questions like this, and the answer is always, it depends. So
of course,
I kind of know that's coming. But is there a way to really be scientific and smart about the fishing pressure? So if you've got a 5-acre pond and all your buddies are wanting to go fishing, can you, in your mind, you say, okay, we're only going to fish this 2 days a week, or you've obviously been around a lot of people that have figured out a way around some of these issues or dealt with them. What's the kind of the standard answer?
That is a difficult question. And a lot of the information I have on it would be anecdotal, just.
But that's very valuable anecdotal. We're hanging on every word.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was talking to somebody earlier so I dealt with a larger lake. It's over 150 acres. And there was a gentleman that fished every morning, every afternoon, day after day after day. And this lake is a good lake. It had a few problems, but the catch rate was declining over time. And they kept decent records. So they knew what they were catching, when, and all that. But there was just kind of a steady decline. And this person was the litmus test, basically. They were using him as he's the one catching all the fish. He's the one telling us it's going down. And we would shock it. The fish population was there. The bass were there. Just the catch rate was kind of declining. And it's like, what other way can you explain? It's a big lake. You wouldn't think one person could have that much of an impact, but what I would say to that is if you're using the same baits over and over and over again,
Yep.
It changes.
I bet he liked the same. He was like, I like crankbaits, or I like worms, or I like jigs, or whatever kind of guy. And he probably presented it so many times.
And probably the same general areas. He had his spots. He was like, I know I can catch fish here and here and here. And those fish, if they have that little spot as a home range, they get used to that. So I think there's something to be said for that. There were a couple folks, it was a club basically, and they would limit the number of people on a lake to twice a week or something like that, just to try to limit that type of thing. So fishing pressure is real. I do believe it has an effect, but it's hard to say where that threshold is when you really start seeing it. There's a lot that goes into the fish population as far as genetics and things like that. Like if you have northern bass, they're more aggressive. Your catch rates are going to be better in general. So if you have Floridas, it's hard to say has your catch rate declined because of fishing pressure or just because these fish are getting older, and as they get larger, they get harder to catch. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly why you would be catching less.
Yeah. One time we've mentioned Barry Smith here, my dear friend. So,
long time.
Yeah. And, he loves to, so when we're together, he asks me hunting questions and I ask him fishing questions.
Why would he ask you hunting questions?
Maybe I don't know.
I always thought he was this brilliant guy. Now,
just trying to be nice.
Sure.
Yeah,
he is a nice guy. You're right. Okay. That gets it. That explains it.
So, I'd say like, well, how do I catch these? I know they're there.
Shiners.
And he said, well, there's a reason why when guys go to Lake Okeechobee in Florida that they end up using shiners instead of artificial baits. And it's just, those fish are they wary? What is it about them?
Yeah, they're just clearly more skittish around people in general. Not that they're seeing you in the boat or anything like that, but just from my experience, if you had a group of adult Floridas in one tank and adult Northerns in the other, if you walk up to the Floridas, they immediately get away from you or start jumping like scared. The Northerns, they're more calm, they're more aggressive, they're waiting to get fed, something like that. So they're slower when they get bigger like that. They're just
finicky. Smart.
Yeah, they're smart.
That one giant one I caught one time, it was clear enough I could see a couple of times it followed a bait in. So the next time I had just a weightless worm just piddling one morning at the camp, and I just let it stop, and that fish came up behind it like the hands of a clock. It took it probably 30, 40 seconds and got right up to the nose, up to that worm, and just sat there. I was like, what is it going to do? And finally, literally maybe the whole time I saw 30, 40 seconds and just popped his mouth open and sucked it in. But it did not charge hit or anything. It was so slow. I got to watch it. Yeah. It was so cool.
And that fish was like 12 pounds.
12.6.
Wow.
That's a giant.
On the wall here somewhere. I was at the camp. That's right. Yep. It's the only one I ever killed that I caught that big. I just wanted the real fish mounted one time.
That was a huge fish.
Yep.
Do you see a lot of fish get over 10 pounds?
Not a lot. Not as many as you would think. Sampling, when you're sampling electrofishing, you get you're getting a lower percentage of the fish population than you think. Normally, I've heard different numbers thrown around, but I think 10 to 20%, depending on how big it is.
Wow. That'd be pretty good.
So if let's say we got 10% of a fish population, and in a sample electrofishing, we want to get at least 30 bass. So we can, statistically, it'd be significant. But out of 30 bass, if it's a decent pond, the most abundant size will be around 15 inches. And then you'll have, let's say you have 4 or 5 fish over 20 inches in that group. And so one of them might be something like 8 to 10 pounds or bigger. And then the rest of them are going to be that normal average 15-inch range. And so I have seen trophy bass lakes where there's one in particular in Tennessee we shocked, and we caught 4 that were 10 pounds or bigger. They were 10 to 11, but they were obviously, to me, all from the same year class.
Right.
So this was like the original stock. They grew real fast. They stayed together kind of size-wise. We caught 4 of them. We saw 2 more that looked identical that got away from us. So 6 10-pounders in the same situation.
Now, where was this?
That's unheard of.
Yeah. Can you drop a pin for a brother?
So I can attest 2 different lakes that Barry's helped us with just about everything. And, but going by what you recommend and the formula and everything, 2 different lakes that I know for sure that at 3 years old, just under 3 years old actually, caught fish over 9 pounds. That's on 2 different lakes. And that's weighed on digital scale. That's no puff. It was actually, you'll usually stock them in June. This would have been in like April. So it wasn't quite, probably a 3-year-old fish to the day, but hadn't even been stocked 3 years. That's 2 different times. And I know that's pretty exceptional. Now, I don't know if they may have stopped after that. We've caught some bigger fish, but I'm just saying there's so many different ponds and soil types and situations and, the size of the pond, the depth. There's just so many variables, which I'm sure makes it so fascinating for you. But if you go by their formula, you will maximize what your potential is. Guarantee. Now, once you get past probably 3 or 4 years, that's when the work really starts.
Exactly. If you could be dialed in enough as to what your fish population is doing, making sure the bass have the right size forage at the right time is key to growing them big. And so, like, if you get them up to 6, 7, 8 pounds, if you want to keep them going, they have to have the bigger food items. They can't be chasing around 1 to 3 inch bluegill to try to keep that girth on them.
Right.
So that's when you want to make sure your bluegill population is abundant enough to have the 6, 7, 8, 9 inch fish. It takes a big bass to eat a 9 inch bluegill, but
They'll do it.
6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
And that's when you also look at other forage options as well. I think in one of the other podcasts, they talked about gizzard shad.
Yes.
That has a role in trophy bass management. It's not for everybody, and it doesn't do well in every situation, but it can play a role to push those big bass a little further if that's what your goal is.
Man, I love threadfin shad. Well,
while we're talking about that, what are the main forage species that you may recommend somebody introduce if that's what their goal is trophy bass? Yeah,
bluegill needs to be number one. By themselves, bluegill can support a bass population. So they have to be abundant. They have to be the right sizes. You want to see them across the range of sizes from 1 to 10 inches. And there, if you're paying attention to what's happening as you walk around your pond bank, you should be seeing 3 to 4, 5 inch bluegill all over the place. You want them highly abundant. Second to bluegill would be the threadfin shad. They do have some negatives where they can experience winter kill if you have a cold winter in this area. So you might lose them all in that situation. And I've seen recently I saw a lake where the threadfin shad population was excellent, just dense. The bluegill were scarce, and the bass were plump. The bass looked good, and everybody's like, "Oh, this is a great situation. The bass look healthy, all this." And right now it is. But if this winter we have a serious freeze, you just flip that whole situation around.
And then there's no bluegill brim for them to munch on.
Right. And so bluegill, threadfin shad, golden shiners can be in there. Where they're legal, tilapia can play a role. Gizzard shad would be something I would only add in certain situations where you have the big bass already. You want to put them in, and the big bass keep going on them.
Is there anything you don't recommend that you see folks using?
Green sunfish is a problematic fish that competes with your bass, competes with your bluegill for food. They have a large mouth and they can affect the balance. So that's not something I know of anybody really actively stocking to try to just use as forage, but I've seen where somebody had a bunch of extra ones, and just like throw them in, feed the bass, that type of thing. They could mess with your balance.
So, in part of the reason why crappie are not recommended on especially smaller ponds is not only for the same reason as the competition, but their spawn is actually before bass.
That's right.
As where the brim spawn is after bass. So the little bass fingerlings, maybe whatever, an inch or two already, when the brim fry hatch, they just gorge on them, and it's perfect. But the crappie will actually eat the little bass fry.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that's the timing of the spawn is what will mess it up too. So I don't know. I've read and read and read. I've asked Barry questions about that. I love crappie fishing too, but he's like, really, even in a bigger pond, you got to work at it. I know the one we have turned out great, but it's just kind of a natural oxbow type thing. The river can get in it too. And it's even got grinnell. They brought the bass, and they stocked the brim and the crappie. And then he brought bass and some striped bass, which are real aggressive to keep the numbers down. And the water was so acidic, they said, I don't think anything could have survived. So and to their credit, being honorable, they didn't charge anything. They put the fish back in they didn't release the fish, and, we'll just come back and test it in a couple of years. And almost immediately the next year, we started catching, crappie and brim, and we actually just threw a few bass in there on our own just to see what happened. And, I think the river put some in there. Now it's kind of a really good oxbow kind of a lake, but I think the grinnell and some of that probably helped keep the numbers somewhat in check. There's probably a few too many, but I guess what I was getting at is like, you don't want to have a 2 or 3 or 4 acre crappie pond. That's really difficult, right?
It is. Well, having crappie with bass, having the two together, that's very difficult to keep the forage numbers up to where they're both of decent size. So there's a way to do a crappie pond without having bass in there. You have to use a little bit different forage strategy. The crappie will do better on more slender type baits like shiners, like fathead minnows. Bluegill should probably still be in there, but once bluegill gets a certain size, the crappie can't eat them. So we don't want them to be the primary source of food. So if your fathead minnow and your shiner production is not very good, you need to be ready to restock forage periodically to keep the crappie going.
And catch a lot of them. That would be
and catch a lot of them. You'd want to start it the same way you do a bass lake. So start with the forage, let it build up, and then come in with crappie fingerlings. I wouldn't try to put larger crappie, just jump them in there, because they're going to hurt that balance from the get-go. And so you still want to establish the forage, let it build up for 3 months to a year, even longer if you wanted to. But and then put the crappie in there. That way you have faster growth rates on those things.
So I want to jump back to something Toxie said earlier about his bass growing so fast, and here,
and that was but again, it wasn't my doing, it was their doing.
Sure.
By going by their formula.
Sure. So we're dealing with American Sport Fish Hatchery. Barry and Don started that. You went to work there. Now I think you're an independent biologist. The lake at the Mossy Oak Golf Course. They originally helped stock that lake with all female fish, and it's about 7 or 8 acres of water in that one, and there's the one above it. But I think they stocked 20 12-inch females per acre. And just this past spring, Brad Suck, he sent pictures to me of several fish around 8 pounds. So those fish are 3 years old. Maybe 4 years old because they were 12 inches when they got here. So, but that's some pretty phenomenal growth there as well.
That is nice, yeah.
But now, so the whole idea behind that is you don't have, if you're not taking fish out of the lake, it's not going to get overpopulated.
Well, then they don't reproduce so fast and eat up. Right. That's the big thing.
So only 20 female fish in a 7 to 8 acre lake?
I think that's right.
20 per acre, wasn't it?
20 per acre.
Yeah.
Maybe
20 per acre. Because I remember thinking, well, there's 140.
Maybe I can catch one.
Yeah. So does that sound right?
Yeah, 20 per acre sounds about right. I wouldn't say 20 for the whole thing.
Do you have a lot of experience with those all-female? Is that catching on?
It's more popular now. Yeah, absolutely. You're seeing it more and more, people trying to do it. And I think I mentioned on the last podcast I was here on that I dealt with a few of them back in the day, and one of the problems we ran into is people did not like the low catch rates.
Right.
So if you're gung ho ready for trophy bass, you want to have some patience as well.
Yeah.
Because you'll have to work at it because basically what you're doing is you're gorging these fish with plenty of food, making sure they grow as fast as they can and get as large as they can. So they're not sitting there starving looking for a lure, so you're gonna have to work at trying to get them to bite.
Plus, they don't ever go through the spawn and lose that weight from that too.
That's right.
And the problem, I think, is that it doesn't take but one male to just completely mess it up in just a few years.
But what tends to happen in those situations, in trophy bass situations, is you get so many bluegill in there, they can repress the bass spawn because they harass the bass on the beds. So if you did get a male in there, you probably have so many bluegill in there that they wouldn't do much. They'll try to spawn, they'll eat the eggs or whatever.
Wow.
So it has its utility. It's a way to manage, and if you want trophy bass, it's a good way to do it. If you had multiple lakes at your disposal, it'd be a good idea to try it in one and then have your balanced fish population in your other lake.
Just that lake you've wanted, clearly doesn't care about catching a lot of fish, the best chance of
yes, sir.
a serious trophy. And I'm guessing too, that would be your top recommended lake that you'd want to come back and check it for them at least every year or two.
Yes, sir.
And maybe replenish and so forth.
Yeah. One of the keys to that is establishing the age classes of bass. So you don't want to put one age class of females and then leave them, because sooner or later they're going to die from a predator or just old age, and you're not going to have anything up there filling in those gaps. So you want to I always told folks put at least some every year or every other year,
right,
just to kind of keep that age cycle.
So that segues me into something I want to ask, and don't want any names, but I recently read a book called Sow Belly, and it just kind of pointed out that there are a lot of people across the South, individuals, wealthy guys, that maybe are trying to grow a world record bass and doing some extraordinary things to try to do it. Can you share any stories you may have heard that?
The sensational novel. Here we go.
Here we go. I mean, surely you've got something.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few that come to mind that are trying to use different types of forage to push the system. So basically, like we talked about, bluegill, threadfin shad, some of these other things, tilapia, and then gizzard shad, and then you could try freshwater prawns, which is a type of freshwater shrimp. There are some folks I'm aware of that would build a bait pond, like a 1 acre pond above the main lake, raise something in there, let it build up in number, reproduce everything, and then drain it into the main lake and just try to flush it with bait, basically. So there's some things like that, and then there are others that put everything in there that the bass would eat. So bullfrogs, crawfish, rainbow trout, small rainbow trout that are good feeding size for bass.
Wow.
So there are people trying to grow it for sure. But the biggest bass that I've heard of in the last year or so, people catching basically out of Texas, like 15 pounds, 13 pounds, stuff like that. But some of those are out of the big reservoirs.
Don and Barry said that the most important thing was putting a fence around it to keep, and I want to say they were telling me to keep otters out of it. That if you had trophy bass in a lake, that otters would clean you out.
Well, I'm sure it's your proximity to a main tributary too would be a lot to do with otters.
Am I remembering that right?
We rarely see them at all, honestly.
Yeah, I think in certain places, like he's saying, if there's a drainage there or it's close to a creek, they seem to be getting worse in places. But they tend to go after larger fish first.
Interesting.
And so they can take the top off of your bass population, basically. And I've seen that in multiple places. And so, you go do an electrofishing assessment, you catch your sample of bass, and it's like you catch bass from 5 inches up to 15, and there's nothing above it. And it's like, what's going on, So predators, they're serious predators, and normally they travel in groups or family, and an adult otter can eat like 10 pounds of fish a day. So
Wow.
So it's significant if they're present.
I'm still the worst is the cormorants. They're the worst. I mean, there'll be none, there's none, then there'll be hundreds. They migrate.
And
Are they
a lot
still
of-
considered a federal migratory bird, or aren't they?
I think they are, yeah.
But aren't they not native to the United States, to
they're
North
not.
America?
No, they're not.
Yeah,
From
and
Japan.
Toxie's pond, you'll catch fish that have scars on
Oh
the
yeah,
back.
yeah, all over. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm talking 3-pound fish. The scars, but you tell me, but I heard they can eat 1.5 pounds a day per bird.
That's right.
What?
Why are we
Devastating.
protecting them if they're not from around? What
That's
is?
a good question. I think
And they can eat
the
a pound
catfish
bass,
farm,
too.
they were really devastating on catfish fingerlings.
Scavengers.
Yep.
Yeah, I think they can do depredation on catfish ponds. You
Yeah.
probably have to get a permit. I've had buddies
They have
in
the cannons.
past that did that for a living. Got to hunt all day.
We just try to scare them off. Barry said, go in right at when they come in, especially the roost. You got to do it 2 or 3 days in a row and just stay there and keep them run off, and that'll stop them for a little while. But they're a problem. The problem with the main, our great lake there at the camp, we left too many standing cedar trees, and when we drained it one other time, they wiped it out. It's like 30 acres.
Yeah.
They pretty much wiped it out. We drained it and started over, and it did wonderful again. And we took 2/3 of the trees out, but we left some. And if we ever do it again, or if I want to get it back, I'm just going to cut everything off right above the water. It'll just be a little stump or something. But they just love sitting in the trees right over the water. And I just built a perfect pond for them and buzzards too. So
Yeah. Wow.
it's frustrating to see nature take it away from you, but it is what it is.
Dudley, what you got?
Well, I was going to take it in a little bit different direction, but talking about pond construction and maintenance. What is a good way to manage the backside of your pond dam? How do you want to do that? And then I want to get into what are do's and don'ts of installing a spillway when you're building a pond?
Yeah, so the backside of the dam, it makes it way more easier way more easy if the slope is gentle, so you can mow it without being afraid of it. That way, if you have somebody working for you that's not as comfortable on something as you are, that it gets mowed pretty regularly. That way you don't have any trees growing on it. So that's the main thing, is keeping trees from growing on it and creating a root system that can go into the dam and later cause you problems. Making sure it's vegetated is good, some type of grass on it in order to prevent any kind of erosion. And then when it comes to a spillway, most of the time, like the emergency spillways, they should be built into the hard ground. So on that very edge of the lake, or very edge of the dam. That way, if you ever have to use it in a torrential rain or something like that, it's eroding actual bank and not the actual dam. But things you can do on the spillway to make it a little more stable is lay down landscaping cloth, put riprap rock on it. And that way, if it's ever used in a heavy rain event, it's substantial and it's not going to erode on you.
So do folks, do you normally just recommend that basic spillway with the riprap, or adding like a pipe or something like that?
Yeah, most of the time there's a drain system on there. So it's either a standpipe where you have a upright that goes down to a T and then goes through the base of the dam. That's the most common thing in previous years. Nowadays, a lot of people are going to the siphon system, which the siphon basically goes down into the deep water. It comes up to the height of the water line, and that's where it goes through the dam. And so you don't have to have a pipe down very deep. Mm-hmm. It's right there at the water line. So
if something was to go wrong, it would be easy to fix.
That's right. And so going out the backside of the dam, normally they're buried into the backside of the dam, so you can still mow and not have anything in your way. But the siphon system, the beauty of it is it draws water from deeper, so it's not taking water off the surface.
That could have a bloom on it.
That could have a bloom and is more productive, right? And they can be put in after the fact. You already have a lake, you already have water in it. You can put it in without having to drain the lake. So there's some benefits there. If you had a standpipe system, there's they call it a trash rack with a deep water draw. So basically, let's say you had a 12-inch pipe as your standpipe, you would take like a 24-inch pipe and set it over it. It sits on the top of the pipe. It pulls water from the bottom up the pipe and into the standpipe. And so
Pretty slick.
it pulls water from down deep as well. So you can keep your more fertile water in longer.
I was going to ask you about whether how you preferred that, because the old timey ponds were pulling off the top, and it seems like more and more people are understanding.
Older ones we have, because we built some 30 years ago, they had built, wasn't by off, so there was like almost a barrel sticking up out there.
Right.
The water got high enough to go into this bed. It looks about, I bet they're 3 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what's
30 inches, 3 feet around out there. And then they all had emergency spillways too. So everything we have has a pipe and a spillway.
So, look, we've got some questions. I've got some notes here. We're going long. Doug's going to have to get up and run. Then a little while he's got some kind of dance lessons or something. He's got to go. But if I want you to just talk real fast about a couple of subjects, and we'll move on. So here's what I want to ask. Talk to us real quick about liming a pond.
Okay, so some lakes do not need lime, but some do. So it's based on a measurement called total alkalinity, and that's basically a measure of the buffering capacity of the water. And what that is does the water keep the pH within a certain range that's healthy for fish?
That's always been confusing to my mind and most people's minds. Instead of just saying the pH of the water, it's like the ability of the water to change the pH.
Right.
Something like
keep
that.
it in a safe range, basically. And so the cutoff we measure for is 20 parts per million. So if your alkalinity is greater than 20 parts per million, generally fertilizer will react properly and produce the plankton bloom you want. If it's less than 20 parts per million, fertilizer that you add gets bound to the soil and it's wasted basically. So if you have to have lime added to your lake when it's under construction, it's pulverized ag lime or limestone, crushed limestone. You can add it in the basin of the lake when it's under construction, or most of the time the way it's applied is it's put in from a lime barge, which is like a large pontoon boat. You load the lime onto it and you spray it off with a pump that's sucking water out of the lake. And what you're doing is you're treating the soil in the lakes, and so you want to basically cut lanes across the lake like you're mowing the grass. Cover the entire lake basin as best you can. There are some other options there. There's liquid lime nowadays. With the liquid lime, you're treating the water. You're not treating the soil, so it's more short-lived, but it's effective.
Talk just a little bit about.
So real quick, soil test before, once they've prepared the lake and scraped off everything. So a soil test will tell you if you need to put lime in prior.
Yeah, you can do a soil test, or
good.
if it already has water, you could do a water test.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk about mechanical aeration.
Okay, so mechanical aeration, generally, when we think of that, it's surface aeration. So it would be something that would break the surface of the water, get it in contact with the atmosphere, add oxygen to it, and just push a current, basically. So they make some that are electric paddle wheels that you see at some of these catfish farms. They're large horsepowers for large lakes. You see some that are 1 to 2 horsepower that looks like a box floating on the water. It throws up a plume about 2-3 feet maximum. And what that does is it's adding air to the water and stirring it up. There's some other types of aeration, diffuser systems, which is you have an air compressor that's mounted on the bank, and you have this weighted tubing that goes down to diffuser heads that are spread out throughout your lake. So those systems have to be spec'd out for the size lake you have, the depth, and they figure up how much water they're going to move throughout the day. So they're not so much adding oxygen. They are adding oxygen, but it's not a lot. But they're moving the water and mixing the water. So they help destratify the lake and prevent it from developing layers during the summertime. So those are the primary ones.
And that could play a big role in keeping that pond healthy.
Yes, it basically it allows oxygen to be released down deep and have oxygen near the soil, which can help decompose organic material and things like that. But also that mixing of the water column, moving water tends to be healthier water. it can metabolize the wastes more and things like that.
And potentially prevent you from having what the old timers call a turnover.
Correct. Yeah. It can still happen. I have seen fish kills where you had one of those systems in place, so it's still possible to have a fish kill, but sometimes the fish kills are due to, like, it'll prevent a turnover because you don't have the layers developed.
Yeah.
But it is possible to have fish kills due to just a low oxygen event. If you have several days of cloudy weather or thunderstorms, things like that, your plankton production could be lower on the oxygen side, and oxygen gets low one night, and that can cause one. Or you can have a plankton die off sometimes, and that can cause one.
So the lake, like you, severely infested with weeds lake, could it deplete oxygen and make it easier to have a turnover kill, or that might not make any difference?
Yeah, sometimes if you have a lot of vegetation and the water is very clear, your thermocline will be lower in the water, so deeper. Having that much vegetation can kind of choke out the sunlight to some of it, so it can cause problems as well. Yeah.
Okay. I thought maybe it would made it more susceptible to, especially in a shallower. Seems like the one we had, the shallower, didn't ever really have a deep spot. It turned over, and it had the one that had too much lotus and all. It turned over and it was a heavy rain overnight.
Yeah.
Cold rain, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Cold rain, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk real quick about the importance of fertilizing your pond, because that's something anybody can do. And it just makes a pond more productive. But I'd like to hear it from you.
Yeah, so fertilization definitely helps productivity in lakes. And so you can triple or quadruple the amount of poundage of fish you can raise in a given body of water. And, like we talked about, you want to promote the food chain as best you can in order to grow these fish and keep them in balance and just have a overall balanced fish population. So the keys to fertilization is to pay attention to what's going on around you, pay attention to your water. When you walk up to your pond bank, if it's time to fertilize, you want to look at the water clarity. You want to look at how clear is the water? Is it murky at all? And then do you have any vegetation in there that'll cause you a problem if you do apply that fertilizer? And so also knowing the history of what's going on around you, I have an example of that. Knowing what your what is in your watershed will help determine how much fertilizer you should apply each time or how often. So if you follow the recommendations, basically you're going to be applying fertilizer about once a month based on your water visibility. You want to keep your water visibility 18 to 24 inches, and you want it to be a green color. And so sometimes if you're in a watershed that has livestock or something like that, you have a natural input of fertilizer every time it rains. And so you should try to take that into account as well. So you don't want to just say, I'm going to do this every month like clockwork. You want to see what's happening in the lake and react to it. And so I have one example. There was a lake I was dealing with, and I didn't know it, but in the watershed was a huge cattle pasture. Where I was with the lake, it was all wooded around it, so I didn't know what was beyond the woods. And so I fertilized it in March like you're supposed to, and I did actually a half rate just to see how it would progress. This lake turned orange. Like, it was this thick plankton bloom that was green/orange, and
wow.
It was beyond what I'd expected. But the reason it happened was because there were so many nutrients coming down the watershed every time it rained, and I just kind of kicked it off. And for the next 3 months, it stayed heavy like that. And so some lakes don't require as much fertilizer as others.
Yeah.
And so it's good to know what's around you, and then, apply according to what you're seeing. So water clarity, is it nice clear water? It's time to fertilize. Is there any vegetation there? That might have you hold off, take care of the vegetation, then get back to fertilizing, and try to target 18 to 24 inches. One thing I tend to do in the summertime is you can have other things show up like blue-green algae you don't want so much of. You don't really want it, but it tends to show up in hotter weather. But what you can do is, instead of targeting 18 to 24, target 24 to 36 inches of visibility. So don't apply as much. Back off a little bit on the fertilizer in the summertime. Just keep it a green color. You still have the production, but you're not going to push the system and have too many of those blue-green algae.
Well, our Perfect Pond Plus, you've applied a lot of it through the years. It's water soluble, so it dissolves in that upper part of the water column. It's got a micronutrient pack. I couldn't be more proud of
Oh,
that product.
it's a great product. It's the best product there is. It really is.
So that's a way a guy can really affect the health of his pond.
Absolutely,
Just to pay attention to that, and we start talking about it when the water temperatures get about 60 degrees, and then you might do that or need to do that through September.
Yeah, September, October, and then I like to pay attention to what's going on around you. So this past year, February, the last 2 weeks of February was pretty warm in our area. And so if you were paying attention, you could have went ahead and applied that first application a little early and got a jump start on the season. But through October and sometimes November is still warm enough in the 60s water temperature wise to do it. So it could be an 8-month window. It could be a 10-month window, depending on what kind of winter season and what kind of spring we have coming out of it. But being consistent with it, that helps keep vegetation problems at bay. The more consistent you are with the fertilization and keeping your bloom where it needs to be, the better off the fish will be, food chain wise.
Laney, you got any more? I scratched through all my notes there.
Well, I got a lot more questions. I don't think we had enough time.
The whole thing about managing a pond is so interesting.
It is.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about some bigger ponds and people with resources to do, but it could be anybody. It could be by 1 acre. I mean, you probably need to be even more disciplined. I think if I remember Barry saying one time, just a general rule of thumb, not absolute, the bigger the pond, the more it kind of manages itself more, and of course, at the same time, I've learned with a bigger pond or two that it's more work sometimes, but you really got to be disciplined with a smaller pond without a lot of cover and whatever, but you can do some pretty cool things too. I just want to make the point, it's for everybody. And it could be there's a pond already and you just want to start over. That's what I would recommend. I know that's spending some money, but even on a smaller pond, it's not that much money. And you can get extraordinary results by starting from scratch and letting them, tell you what to do, part by part.
What about feeding fish? Where do you fall on that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that definitely plays a role. And there are some situations where fertilization is not the greatest thing for you. Maybe you have too much water flowing through your pond and you can never keep a bloom. Situations like that, supplemental feeding definitely helps. And most of the time, the feed is only going to the bluegill. So you're promoting the condition of the bluegill, keeping them in better health. They have better egg quality, and therefore their spawns are more successful. So in trophy bass management, we also are feeding the bluegill we're trying to feed the bass everything we can. We need that reproduction from the forage happening all the time. So feeding is definitely something we recommend.
I got to go out on a limb and say there's not a better table fare in saltwater or fresh than a copper-nosed bluegill who's been eating that fish feed. They are phenomenal. And you get them big enough to be more meat.
Yeah.
You can grow some pretty decent slabs. And I'm telling you, it's hard to beat as a table fare. Diane loves to eat fish too, but she can't stand fishy tasting fish.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the most delicious flesh of any fish, I think, even crappie.
Toxie's got a couple of ponds with the feeders running, and you'll see them go off, and inevitably within the copper nose or pop, all of a sudden there's going to be something like a big something comes through.
Well,
there.
here's the other second question I had. That was a comment about how great they are to eat. That's one good reason to brim fish around them. Have to take the kids. It's phenomenal. But what do you do about the grass carp taking it over?
Yeah, the grass carp.
Because they really can spoil the parade of eating the fish food. They're terrible about it. So do you have to take them back? No, but the grass carp literally will completely take over the feeder and not even let the brim even eat.
Yeah. So you can scare them off by shooting over them a couple times, and it'll run them off for a short amount of time. But if they're a serious problem, what I say is catch them out of there. You can super glue a feed pellet to a hook and have some fun with it.
Oh, you can get the little crappie nibbles.
There you go, yeah.
And put it on a fly rod, and you might as well be in Florida tarpon fishing.
Yeah.
Those things will get, how big will they get?
30, 40 pounds.
That's right.
I hadn't heard about that happening.
They'll take over you. I've been hearing about it, but just in the last 4 or 5 years, just devastatingly take it over everywhere you're trying to feed them.
Well, so I'm seeing big bass come up and hit the rim. That's
no question.
Saying. Wow. What else you got, Lanny?
Robby and I were talking about on the grass carp thing. It was interesting that you brought the older the the carp gets, the less it does for the lake.
That's right. Yeah, we tend to say the effective lifespan of when they're cleaning up the vegetation like they should. They eat more of it when they're younger, so they have an effective lifespan of about 5 years. So if they've been in there 5 years, go ahead and stock some more if you still need them. And normally we leave the older ones and they just kind of cruise around and graze a little bit, but they're not providing the service you stocked them for at that point.
Never
So,
do that.
I don't know how fast they grow. How you put them in there about a pound, maybe?
Yeah, they're about a third of a pound. They're 9 to 11
I
inches.
thought they said they were
or
almost a
10
pound.
to 12,
So
half pound or so.
I'm not mistaken. One washed up in a big tractor rut from some overflow, and Neil and one of his buddies wrestled it out, in the summer, and it weighed like 18 pounds.
Yeah, that was
They
me
wasn't-
and Sam, wasn't it?
It was actually that was him and Blake Miller, I think it was. I can't remember.
We caught a big one with Sam in here too.
Yeah, but this wasn't a wild carp. This was a grass carp, whatever, and it could not have been but 2 years old.
Oh my gosh.
So it was like 18 pounds in 2 years.
Shoot.
Yeah, they eat like 100% of their body weight a day in vegetation. So
That's crazy.
when they're young, they eat like crazy. And
Well, you can see them at
fast.
Waverly. Even when they first started, they would dump the grass clippings in the lake.
Yeah.
that's right.
And not have to worry about it because you could just see, just like catfish feeding on, they'd be eating those grass clippings.
Yeah. So why are some fish darker than others? Is there something going on? Is that like a suntan?
Yeah, so especially like bass, they can change their pigment a little bit. It's not really fast, but over the course of a few days, they can change their pigment based on their background or what color water they're in. So you can, like in the past, we've harvested bass and pulled them out of natural water where they're the nice green color, nice camouflage pattern. You put them in a light colored tank, and over a few days, they'll lose some of that camouflage pattern and lighten up. So they can adjust their color based on the water they come out of. You've probably seen some of the tannic acid water, looks like sweet tea, nice dark water.
A really dark green bass.
Yeah, they come out of there.
Green
and they're
trout.
pretty.
Yeah.
That's right.
Green.
Yeah, they are
That's right.
beautiful when they come
Oh,
out
they
of that
sure
water.
are.
Yeah.
They are.
So from what I understand, bass are actually really smart. And this whole thing of them learning lures is a really legitimate thing.
I think it is. Yeah. I mean, I mentioned the one example. I think the lure selection and things like that can play a role in the pressure situation, but they're smarter than you think. And, you've seen some of the videos probably of people training them to feed out of their hand and stuff like that. So it makes sense to me that they can learn what they're seeing and realize that's not something I want to bite. So
What I come back to again and again and again, it doesn't matter if we're talking about fish or fowl or deer or whatever, and being a gamekeeper, nature adapts again and again and again. And this is another example of it's gonna adapt. The whole miracle of the way, everything works, it's gonna continue to adapt, plants, animals, everything. So it makes sense to me over time, especially.
It really does. Wow. Well, so Robby, is there something that we should have covered? Some kind of question that you thought, well, these guys, if they know anything about ponds, they're going to ask this.
not about fish or ponds. I'd like to know about Mr. Fox's turkey vest. Like, how did that go? That's
for you.
That's
It
a
went
special
great.
thing. So
Excuse me. It was an amazing
It
event.
was.
It was just for me and the family and everybody at Mossy Oak, it was kind of otherworldly almost. It was you made me stop and think back to the event we had here and the feeling in the air. You can just feel when there's an air of, for lack of a better word, love, and
yeah,
it's just something really special going on. And there was so much love that, he just kind of represents the best of the spring turkey thing, because he grew up with it and
That's how this place got started.
through and so especially since he's one of the oldest, surviving turkey hunters.
yeah.
And so it was, it was amazing to see, because people have been following, and again, the credit goes more to my two sons, way more than me. They have decided to do that with their papa in the last, 6, 8, 10 years, and people have started to follow him in his spring. So unfortunately, this was the first spring in his life he was not able to kill a turkey. He got to go one time, so that to me that was a miracle. He watched the sunrise. I got some video of that. He was just in amazement like a little kid watching that sunrise because he never gets to get out much anymore at all. So it's tough, but what a blessing to see people honor him. And then an event like that, we've done some other things. There's the Fox Foundation, which is our charitable arm. There's the, Mr. Fox A scholarship at Mississippi State and in the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries and Forestry. And there's things we've done to honor what he's brought to us and all, but that vest probably tops the cake for all of it. And
100%.
Just wanted it to be fun for everybody and everybody to own one. And, along with that, sometimes there's always someone spoils it a little bit, but for the most part, it was amazing. And so I don't know what else to say about it other than thank you to everybody for the love they showed towards him. Life-changing for all of us here.
We do have a trivia question that we can that Richie can ask, and if you get this, so if you leave a review you've listened to our podcast before, you've actually been here before, but if you leave a review, we might randomly pick you, and you got a chance to win a prize, and we've got some of the Leopold sunglasses. So if you answer this question right, one of our lucky winners.
So Lanny, they're gonna give him Lanny's glasses. Good.
We are.
Yeah.
Finally, not in my closet. Yeah.
They've gotten all of your stuff out of yours. Now they're looking into mine.
Because that's where all of mine actually went to, I think.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
Yeah, your closet served us well for a while. All right, Rich.
All right, so definitely the best and most informative podcast about everything outdoors. Listening to y'all helps old and new hunters with their outdoors or hunting experience with the management skills. Great guests, very easy to listen to. Can't wait to listen each week. So true or false here. An angler from California named Mac Weekly actually caught the largest largemouth bass ever, 25.1 pounds in 2006. But it did not count towards any records because he foul hooked it. True or false?
True.
Wow.
That was a long pause of about a quarter second hesitation.
You can't have a world record if you snag them.
I guess not.
Well, golly.
Robbie, what would that fish have been worth if he?
25-pound bass.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
And look, you're the expert. What makes those California bass put on so much weight?
Yeah, so Florida bass were stocked there to try to break their records by their state agencies, but also where a lot of those are being caught are areas where they're stocking trout. The state agencies are releasing trout into those lakes. And when they release them, normally they're smaller stuff like that, which is great food size for bass. So that's how.
Yeah, for a 20-pound bass.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? That guy had to be so excited. But
foul hooked him.
Foul hooked it, yeah.
In the back.
That's a huge fish.
Yeah,
Can't
that
imagine.
is fish. So who were we playing for? They need to get in touch with if they won some Leopold sunglasses.
So that's WTF HLELL.
I don't know what that means, but anyway, WTF HLLE, get in touch with us. So, well, guys, we looking around the room. One of the things we close with is what we learn.
I learned I got a whole lot more to learn.
Yeah.
Well, so we did this. So you and Robbie did video on. We will post that video.
Yeah.
It'll be an aquatic weed ID with Robby Mays and helping us ID some of that stuff. So I think our listeners will find that very useful, and we'll post that on or probably our YouTube page. I guess.
Probably something wherever Rob tells us to post it.
Yeah. So pay attention to that. We'll put links in the show notes for that.
One thing, observations, I said it, likely the most important, enjoyable thing you can do to a piece of land, 5 acres or 500 or whatever. Anybody can do it. Even a very small pond, you can create something special. And it's a very complex subject, and there's a lot to learn and read, and especially bringing in someone like Robbie can help you tremendously. Because starting off right makes all the difference. It's like building a house with a terrible foundation. You're going to have trouble forever if you just get the right advice and the right, fish stock and everything to start with. It makes a huge difference. And I'm getting older now, and I realize, I wish I would have done some things right sooner.
Yeah.
And enjoy them for more of my life. So I've learned, School of Hard Knocks, to do it in more disciplined manner. We've got some great ones, but we've got some, I probably could have done better. I learned from that. And you're just better off to start on a good foundation and contact these guys.
Yeah,
Right.
that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, it makes all the difference in the world.
So I learned that these grass carp take over a feeder. I didn't know that at all. Learn something every day. So look, how does a guy get? So it's Robby Mays Pond and Lake
Services.
How does a guy find you?
Yeah, so I could be reached on phone number 334-746-1648 or pondandlakeservices.net, spell out and. I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well. That stuff just started, but Pond and Lake Services.
Yeah, well, we sure appreciate you coming up here and being part of the
100%.
podcast. We've always, Barry highly recommended you many years ago, and you've been around us a bunch, and it's always been.
It's fun to see people doing what God put them here to do.
That's right.
And just, talk about how hard he works and how smart he is and how good he is, but he loves what he's doing for a living, and it shows. That's the coolest thing to say when someone's in their groove or they're doing what God put them here to do.
Well, we're going to be following his recommendation to a T, so we'll document the whole process.
That's the hardest thing too, is we're not going to be able to start from scratch. I'm familiar with that lake from way back. It's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
Yep. That's going to be interesting to see what we can do
Yeah.
with something that's really messed up but has huge potential.
Yeah. So it'll be fun.
Very interesting. Stay tuned.
Yeah. Robby, thank you for traveling up. We've got, I'm going to make sure you get we've got this new Companions brand. It was started many years ago. Been brought back some great casual clothes. We'll send you home with some Companion shirts that you can show off. And,
Instant old friends.
Old friends.
yeah,
That's
we
right.
sure appreciate you coming. Is there anybody you need to say hello to or anything?
Just say hello to the wife and kids. Love
There you
you.
go.
Be home soon. Thank y'all for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I always enjoy spending time with y'all.
Pleasure having you. No question about it.
Big time pleasure.
Yeah,
Yes.
we appreciate it. Why don't you say goodbye, Robby?
Well, goodbye, Robby.
Get us out of here, Richie.
Well done.
There's that good band.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Gamekeeper Podcast. And be sure to tune in again. Subscribe to Gamekeeper Farming for Wildlife magazine, and don't miss the Mossy Oak Properties Fistful of Dirt podcast with my good buddy, Ronnie Cuz Strickland.